The grand ballroom shimmered under the weight of 1,000 flickering candles, their light scattering across gilded walls, polished parquet, and the lofty mirrors that seemed to stretch the space into infinity. Music swelled from a stately orchestra, violins singing high, oboes sighing low, as though the very air trembled with anticipation. Amidst the swirl of gowns and satin and taffeta, corseted waists and powdered hair, she stood, a solitary figure whose presence seemed both impossibly fragile and defiantly upright. Her dress, borrowed and ill-fitted, pulled at her shoulders and clung unevenly to her waist, yet she bore it with a grace born not of comfort, but of necessity. Every whispered glance, every barely concealed smirk from the assembly of debutantes, pressed upon her like a weight she could scarcely endure. She had been summoned to the Duke's ball under the pretense of inclusion, though the truth was crueler. It was a jest, a spectacle for the amusement of those who measured a woman's worth by her lineage and her poise. The air was thick with scented oils, the faint tang of candle smoke, and the metallic note of polished brass. She clenched her gloved hands, knuckles whitening, willing herself to move forward, to lift her chin, though the sting of humiliation pricked behind her ears like winter frost. A hush rippled through the room as she was guided to the center of the parquet by a lady-in-waiting, her heart hammering against ribs that felt far too small to contain it. Across the room, the Duke observed from a balcony, his silhouette framed by the tall, arched window. His dark coat, immaculately tailored, swallowed him in shadow, but his eyes, piercing, calculating, impossibly aware, traced her every movement. He had arrived late, as though time itself had bent to his will, and the whisper of his presence set the ballroom alight with subdued reverence. No one dared speak loudly in his vicinity, yet every eye sought the approval of those same dark, unreadable orbs. She did not know, and could not know, that his attention was not drawn by the joke being played, nor by the gossip-laden expectation that she would falter, but by a spark he alone could perceive, a defiance small and fragile, yet luminous in its honesty. The orchestra swelled, and she was compelled to move. Her first step, hesitant, nearly faltered beneath the weight of so many eyes. A collective murmur of amusement rose from the gathered society, soft at first, then sharper, sharper still, slicing through her composure. The music dictated her motion, yet each step was a negotiation between her terror and a stubborn will to preserve the dignity that had been instilled in her since childhood. One spin too abrupt, one misjudged footfall, and the laughter would claim her wholly. She felt the flush creeping across her cheeks, the heat of shame suffocating her from within. And yet, even amid the torment, a strange rhythm took hold. The movement of her arms, the careful positioning of her feet, became a silent argument with the ridicule that surrounded her. Every delicate extension of her fingers, every subtle lift of her chin, was a protest against the cruel choreography imposed upon her. She became, in those fleeting moments, both the audience and the performer, mastering the contradiction of exposure and control. Whispers swirled like tendrils of smoke. How awkward! Can she even manage? But beneath them, unnoticed by all but one, a quiet poetry began to emerge. The Duke descended from his vantage, gliding down the marble staircase as though the music itself followed his footsteps. The crowd parted instinctively, a current of awe parting before him, and her breath caught at the sight. He stopped a few paces away, and in that instant, the cruel context of the evening seemed to shift, almost imperceptibly. His gaze found hers, not with mockery, not with the amusement that had drawn others to her humiliation, but with the weight of recognition. Something unspoken passed between them, something delicate and raw, an acknowledgement of courage, of a rare honesty in a world rife with pretense. The orchestra's violins rose to a crescendo, and she made another turn, forced but precise, the tips of her toes grazing the polished floor with careful insistence. A collective intake of breath suggested that someone, perhaps more than one, noted the change in her posture, the subtle command she was beginning to exert over her own presence. Even the rival debutantes, previously eager in their sneers, faltered in their amusement, sensing that the evening might not unfold according to their expectations. Every gesture of hers became a ripple, subtle but undeniable, across the surface of the assembled society. A bead of sweat traced her temple, yet her eyes, lifted despite the humiliation, caught the Duke's once more. He was closer now, standing at the edge of the circle, observing with a precision that was both intimidating and exhilarating. His hand rested lightly against the banister, yet the curve of his posture suggested that he might step forward at any moment, altering the course of the evening entirely. She felt the shift in the room as tangibly as the scent of lilies that had been placed upon the side tables, the gentle warmth of candlelight contrasting against the cool weight of the polished floor beneath her. Then, as if in answer to some silent question, he took a single step toward her. The murmur of society dimmed, almost imperceptibly, as though the ballroom itself acknowledged the arrival of something profound. She did not know whether his movement was an invitation or merely observation, yet it was enough to tilt the fragile balance of her composure. The audience's cruel intent remained, but it now hovered alongside an undercurrent of possibility, fragile and potent. Her pulse thrummed in her ears, the music pounding alongside it. One step, one small, deliberate motion, an extension of her hand, a lift of her chin, a breath drawn deep, shifted everything. The laughter had not yet ceased, the whispers still lingered, yet the Duke's gaze, unwavering and intent, promised a reckoning neither of them fully understood. A subtle electricity crackled in the space between them, unseen by the rest, but undeniable in its force. As the orchestra softened, preparing for the next movement, she felt herself caught in the suspension of expectation and consequence. One false move could undo her entirely. Yet the mere presence of his attention, the acknowledgement, the weight of it, imbued her with a courage she had not known she possessed. She turned once more, completing the motion that had begun as a jest, and in that instant she glimpsed not only her own resilience, but the faintest glimmer of change hovering on the horizon. The Duke, standing still yet commanding the entire space with the gravity of his presence, inclined his head ever so slightly, a motion almost imperceptible, yet laden with meaning. And in that subtle gesture, in that quiet recognition amidst the cruel spectacle, she sensed that her fate, once entirely at the mercy of society's mockery, might yet be her own to shape. The ballroom, the laughter, the eyes of the world, all of it, had narrowed to a singular point, a moment poised on the edge of transformation. And then, as the music shifted to a delicate adagio, he moved again, closer still, the question unspoken, the promise unmade, and she realized with a jolt that nothing in this gilded hall would ever be the same. The morning after the ball, the house was alive with a strange mixture of awe and censure. Servants whispered in hushed tones, passing letters and parcels with careful discretion, while the scent of fresh roses mingled with the faint smoke of extinguished candles. She moved quietly through the corridors, her borrowed gown from the previous evening folded neatly in her arms, yet her mind lingered on the gaze of the Duke, the memory of those dark, assessing eyes that had pierced past the artifice and mockery of the ballroom. Every step she took resonated with the weight of yesterday's humiliation, yet beneath it, a spark of something unspoken flickered, possibility. The first token arrived in the form of a small, intricately wrapped package placed delicately upon the writing desk in her chamber. She hesitated, fingers trembling as she lifted the ribbon, untying the delicate bow to reveal a single white camellia pressed between the pages of a note. The paper, creamy and thick, bore a script that was precise and fluid, a hand trained by care, yet marked by unmistakable intention. The words were few but charged, for courage in the midst of cruelty, though none else saw it. Her breath caught, a shiver running through her spine. The gift was anonymous, yet its provenance was obvious to her. The Duke's hand, guided by observation, respect, and perhaps an interest too carefully concealed. She lingered by the window, the morning sun spilling gold across her pale cheeks, and traced the edges of the camellia with gloved fingers. The juxtaposition of her public embarrassment against this private acknowledgment stirred a tumult of emotion she could scarcely name. Pride fought with lingering shame, and curiosity pricked at the edges of her composure. Her thoughts were interrupted by a knock upon the door, delicate but insistent. A footman entered, carrying a second note, this one heavier, edged in gilt. She accepted it with measured grace, aware that every movement was observed by invisible eyes, whether in the household or beyond. The note contained a single sentence: "You are underestimated. Allow me to demonstrate otherwise." It was unsigned, but she knew. The thrill of recognition, of being seen for something beyond the whispers and laughter, sent a subtle flush of warmth across her temples. For the first time, she felt that her dignity might not be wholly lost, that a thread of agency remained. Yet the world beyond her chamber windows was unforgiving, and she sensed that this quiet acknowledgment would stir more curiosity, perhaps more envy. By afternoon, the household corridors became the stage for whispered gossip. The ladies of society, ever hungry for scandal, had already begun to weave their narratives. She fumbled terribly. One declared to another, voice tight with derision. And yet, the second voice faltered. There was a moment, fleeting but unmistakable. The fragmentary phrase carried a weight heavier than the initial criticism, a suggestion that perhaps her grace had not been entirely a failure. Every word, every glance, every carefully modulated gesture from that night was dissected and examined. Yet she remained resolutely distant, aware that the world's eye could not diminish the quiet pulse of courage that had begun to thrum within her chest. When evening descended, bringing with it a frost-tinged wind that rattled the carriage wheels and made the gas lamps flicker, another gesture arrived. A delicate dance invitation, placed discreetly within her hand by a courteous messenger. Its script was formal, polite, yet imbued with intention. Join me for a brief dance at the next gathering. There is much the room cannot see, and yet you deserve to be known. She studied the invitation with a mixture of trepidation and fascination. The ballrooms had been arenas of mockery. Could they also become spaces of revelation? Could a single dance, guided not by jest but by subtle intention, alter the course of perception? Her mother, a woman of delicate patience and careful strategy, watched her silently as she read. "Do you wish to attend?" she asked softly, voice threaded with both concern and cautious encouragement. The young woman hesitated, the shadow of yesterday's humiliation still heavy upon her shoulders. Yet the gift, the camellia, the notes, the invitation, each whispered a counter-narrative to the mockery, an assertion that not all eyes were cruel. "I must," she replied at last, the words quiet but resolute. "For the sake of being seen as I am, not as they wish to perceive me." Preparations followed with meticulous care. Her gown was chosen for modest elegance rather than ostentation. Fabric pale as morning frost, the bodice fitted with understated precision. Hair was arranged in soft waves, restrained yet luminous, framing her face with a gentle glow of determination. Even the smallest details, gloves, slippers, a modest necklace, were selected to convey both refinement and quiet strength. She moved with a deliberate grace, aware that every step was both armor and invitation, a silent argument against the world's assumptions. Upon arrival at the evening gathering, she was met with a chorus of glances, some curious, some scornful, yet others tinged with admiration or suspicion. The air was perfumed with roses and cedar, the soft murmur of conversation punctuated by the occasional laugh or clinking glass. From across the room, the Duke observed her once more, posture measured, gaze unwavering. The subtle shift in his attention, always precise, always intentional, lent a weight to the evening that others could not perceive. The music began, a slow waltz that demanded intimacy and poise. She felt the tension coil in her chest, a mixture of anticipation and residual shame, yet she moved with careful rhythm, attuned to both the notes and the subtle expectations of society. And then, as if to punctuate the night's delicate interplay of perception and reality, the Duke's hand extended toward her. It was neither a demand nor a jest, but an acknowledgment, an assertion that her presence, her courage, and her subtle grace were worthy of notice beyond the murmured judgments of others. She placed her hand lightly in his, and the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Whispers continued, but they were now accompanied by a sense of awe, faint and hesitant, as though the ballroom itself recognized a shift in momentum. Every turn, every step, every delicate gesture became a conversation of its own, a quiet dialogue between two souls navigating a space of expectation, desire, and the fragile poetry of being fully seen. The evening unfolded, each movement measured, each glance weighted with meaning, yet the scandal of her prior humiliation lingered like a shadow in the corners. Even as she danced, subtle notes of envy and speculation crept along the edges of the gathering. Still, beneath it all, she felt the gentle insistence of acknowledgement, the thrill of recognition, and the promise of something as yet undefined but potent. As the waltz drew to a close, the Duke's gaze lingered, a quiet gravity in his dark eyes that silenced the room's murmurs for the briefest instant. He inclined his head slightly, an almost imperceptible gesture charged with significance, and she understood with a sudden, thrilling clarity that the game had changed. The mockery of yesterday had not vanished, but the tide was turning, and the power of subtle attention, deliberate and measured, now lay between them. And in that suspended moment, as candlelight flickered across gilded walls and soft music whispered into silence, she sensed that the next encounter, one step, one gesture, one note of recognition, might very well decide whether she would remain a pawn of society or claim her own quiet triumph. The evening air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp cobblestones and the faint aroma of smoke from distant hearths. She walked briskly along the shadowed streets, cloak wrapped tightly about her shoulders, though it did little to shield her from the tremor in her hands. The world beyond her chambers, so filled with the glitter and scrutiny of polite society, now receded into a hush of rain-spattered lanterns and muted echoes of carriage wheels. She moved toward a small balcony at the rear of her family's estate, a secluded spot that had become her refuge, a place where she could breathe without the weight of expectation pressing against her chest. Her reflection in the window pane, pale and anxious, stared back with wide eyes, cheeks flushed, hair damp with the mist that clung to the night. A soft footfall alerted her before he spoke. The Duke, impossibly still yet undeniably present, emerged from the shadow of the corridor. His dark coat brushed the stone beneath him, and the faint shimmer of candlelight caught the subtle glint of his cufflinks. For a heartbeat, the world seemed suspended. The distant murmur of the estate's halls, the soft drizzle against the balcony's stone ledge, and the faint rustle of leaves in the garden below, all fell away. She felt exposed, as if even the night conspired to observe her. And yet, in his presence, there was neither jest nor judgment, only a weightless acknowledgment of her, of who she truly was beneath borrowed gowns and whispered derision. "May I join you?" he asked quietly, voice low and precise, carrying across the cool night without intrusion. She hesitated, then nodded, sensing in the careful choice of words a subtle permission for intimacy that the society-filled rooms above could never afford. He stepped closer, the space between them charged yet respectful, a precarious balance of proximity and restraint. The drizzle dusted her hair with fine droplets, and she brushed them away with trembling fingers, aware of the electricity that had begun to hum in the air between them. "I wondered if you would find solace out here," he murmured, eyes fixed not on the horizon, but on her. There was a gravity in his gaze, a measure of understanding that did not need speech to convey it. Her heart caught at the tone, a blend of curiosity and quiet reverence, as though he perceived every nuance of fear, pride, and resilience within her. "Society sees only what it wishes," he continued, "yet there is a grace in what it cannot perceive." She looked down, tracing a finger along the cool stone of the balcony ledge. Grace, she whispered, voice taut with unshed emotion, seems often to be measured only in steps and smiles, not in courage or endurance. The words trembled, raw in their honesty, and the Duke's lips pressed into a thin line, as if savoring the resonance of her sentiment. There was a stillness, a pause in which the night itself seemed to lean closer, as though eager to witness the exchange of truth between them. "I have watched," he admitted finally, "and I have seen what others overlooked. Your steps last night were more than mere movement. They were defiance and a quiet command of your own presence." His praise was gentle, deliberate, and entirely unexpected. She felt the heat rise to her temples, not from embarrassment, but from the recognition that someone of such stature, someone whose judgment could shape the room itself, perceived the truth of her worth. She inhaled sharply, and the dampness of the night filled her lungs, mingling with a sense of relief she had not anticipated. "It seems impossible," she said, voice low, "that one could be both the subject of ridicule and yet acknowledged in such a way." The Duke's hand hovered briefly near hers, a mere gesture, yet it carried the weight of unspoken intentions. Her pulse raced, an urgent rhythm echoing the soft patter of rain on the balcony roof. Every shadow, every flicker of lantern light seemed to heighten the tension, making each glance, each breath, a dialogue in its own right. The vulnerability of her confession created an intimacy that the ballroom could never provide. She felt the ache of longing, the sting of mistrust toward the world's expectations, and a fragile hope that perhaps connection, genuine and profound, could exist even amid the harsh scrutiny of society. The Duke, attuned to her subtle shifts in posture and expression, stepped closer still, though without diminishing the space she required. There was an unspoken agreement in the air. The world's judgment would not enter this private sphere. "You carry yourself with an honesty rare among those we encounter," he said, his voice a quiet promise. "And I cannot ignore it, even when the world demands amusement at your expense." Her gaze lifted, meeting his fully for the first time without the veil of courtesy or fear. In that instant, she perceived a depth of intention and awareness that left her breathless. The night, the rain, the distant echoes of society, all faded to insignificance in comparison to the gravity of that shared understanding. Yet even as her heart fluttered with hope, there was tension, a reminder that this fragile intimacy existed in a precarious balance. A rustle of skirts from the garden below hinted that their isolation was not absolute. Whispers might find their way through corridors, and intentions might be misread. Her pulse accelerated, a mixture of thrill and anxiety, aware that the stakes of emotional exposure were as sharp as any sword. The Duke noticed the subtle shift in her expression, and his eyes softened, reflecting an awareness of both her courage and her caution. "I trust you, though I know reason whispers otherwise," she admitted, voice barely above the sighing wind. "It is unwise to confide so freely, yet I cannot help it." The Duke inclined his head, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips, acknowledging the rare gift of trust she had offered him. He extended a hand, not in dance, but in solidarity, a bridge across the distance between fear and courage. Her fingers hovered above his before finally settling in his grasp, a gesture of tentative connection, fragile yet full of potential. The rain intensified, drumming softly upon the balcony roof and creating a rhythm that seemed to echo the quickening of their hearts. She felt a warmth in the contact, a tether against the lingering chill of doubt and society's scorn. And though words were sparse, the shared silence spoke volumes. Each breath, each glance, each deliberate pause, a conversation in the language of vulnerability and unspoken desire. A sudden movement in the shadows, a servant glimpsed through the window, a figure passing too close, broke the spell, reminding them of the fragile nature of their secrecy. The Duke's hand lingered a moment longer before releasing hers, the contact a quiet reassurance rather than a departure. The moment had shifted been observed, and yet it had also solidified something delicate yet undeniable: acknowledgement, recognition, and the first true understanding of each other beyond the theater of public scrutiny. As they stepped back, the storm's intensity softened, leaving only the soft patter of residual rain and the hush of the estate's sleeping halls. She remained at the balcony, heart thrumming, mind alight with the possibilities that had been revealed. The Duke's figure retreated into the shadows, silent yet imprinted upon the contours of her consciousness, and she understood, with both fear and anticipation, that the next encounter, the next word, gesture, or revelation, might redefine the course of her life entirely. And in that suspended instant, the memory of the ballroom's cruelty seemed both distant and yet sharply present, a reminder that society's gaze could wound, but courage and recognition, even brief and hidden, had the power to transform it into something entirely new. The ballroom was transformed under the glow of winter's first frost, lanterns and crystal chandeliers scattering light like stars across the polished floor. Velvet curtains, drawn back to reveal frost-laced windows, caught the pale silver of moonlight, casting long, delicate shadows across the assembly. The air smelled of roses, cedar, and the faint tang of burning wick, a sensory orchestra that heightened the awareness of every heart present. She arrived in a gown of muted ivory, the fabric falling with careful precision, simple yet radiant, her hair arranged in soft waves that caught the light with every turn of her head. There was elegance here, but it was not mere display. It was armor, a deliberate proclamation of quiet dignity. Whispers fluttered like restless birds as she entered. Some voices were sharp, slicing with the remnants of last night's ridicule. She dares to appear again. One hissed, hand pressed to a painted mouth. Others softened at the sight of her poise, the subtle radiance of someone who had endured cruelty and emerged unbroken. Her chest rose and fell with controlled breaths, aware of every gaze, yet determined to make each step a silent argument of her worth. She carried herself with the knowledge that the Duke, positioned near the far end of the hall, would observe every subtle motion with that same meticulous attention that had marked his presence before. The orchestra swelled into a waltz, slow and deliberate, the notes curling through the air like smoke. She felt the familiar tension coil in her stomach, the echo of past humiliation still clinging to her posture, yet beneath it lay a newfound nerve. Her hand trembled slightly as the Duke approached, but the tremor was quickly subsumed by the heat of anticipation. He extended a hand, the gesture neither boastful nor demanding, but precise, deliberate, a tether to something both unfamiliar and undeniable. She placed her hand lightly in his, feeling the strength of his presence without intimidation, an equilibrium of power and vulnerability forming in the space between them. The first steps of the dance were tentative, each movement measured to navigate the prying eyes and murmured judgments. Yet as the music flowed, a rhythm began to emerge, one that belonged solely to them. The Duke's hand guided hers with subtle insistence, his dark eyes tracing the curve of her cheek, the delicate line of her jaw, and the flicker of nerves in her gaze. He did not need to speak. Every measured motion, every nuanced shift of posture, carried language all its own. She felt the ballroom fall away, leaving only the warmth of his proximity and the electric awareness that the past cruelty could not entirely reach here. Around them, whispers persisted, some laced with envy, others with fascination. Yet she no longer felt the sting as acutely. Each graceful turn, each small extension of a hand or tilt of the chin, was both a declaration and a negotiation. She would not be a figure of mockery, nor entirely of curiosity. She was seen, truly, by one whose influence could shape the perceptions of all others, and in that acknowledgment lay a quiet triumph that no words or glances of scorn could undo. "Few possess such composure," the Duke murmured, his voice low enough for only her to hear, yet audible enough to ride over the gentle swell of music. "Yet you wear it as though it were second nature, and not the shield it must be." Her pulse quickened, the compliment brushing against the raw nerve of her past humiliation. She met his gaze, finding in it a depth that had been absent from all others' attention, a recognition of fortitude, of intelligence, of subtle beauty untethered from society's shallow definitions. The dance continued, each turn and glide of their bodies a statement against the cruel spectacle of the previous ball. She moved with deliberate grace, the faint pressure of his hand guiding her through the swirl of silk and whispered judgments. There was an intimacy to the motion, a poetry in the alignment of their bodies that spoke of trust, of potential, and of a connection that society could neither sanction nor diminish. She felt courage swell within her, mingling with a delicate, startling thrill she had not dared to anticipate. At the midpoint, the Duke leaned slightly closer, just enough for her to catch the faint scent of his cologne, a mixture of cedar, smoke, and subtle spice. His voice, soft and deliberate, brushed against her ear. "Do you understand now? One's worth is rarely decided by those eager to judge, but by those who recognize it when they see it." Her heart leapt at the words, an acknowledgment that cut through the long-standing echo of humiliation. She had been measured, dismissed, laughed at, but here, in this precise and intimate moment, her dignity was reclaimed. A ripple of admiration, faint yet perceptible, passed through the assembly. Eyes previously sharp with derision softened, even if grudgingly, and some lips parted in whispers not of ridicule, but of astonishment. She sensed the tide of perception shifting subtly, though it would take time for society to fully reckon with the quiet declaration unfolding in the center of the room. Yet for now, the acknowledgement was theirs alone, a private revolution in a public theater. The music slowed, notes stretching and curling like fog across the polished floor. He held her gaze as they completed the final turn, the subtle pressure of his hand a tether to the vulnerability she had long harbored. Her chest rose with controlled breaths, cheeks flushed, eyes shining with a mix of relief, pride, and burgeoning affection. Society's judgment lingered in the corners, but it could not undo the momentum of this singular moment, the undeniable recognition that dignity, courage, and subtle grace could transcend cruelty. Then, almost imperceptibly, a shadow shifted at the edge of the room. A rival, previously amused by her humiliation, lingered nearby, eyes sharp with suspicion and envy, lips curved in a thin line that promised interference. The moment of triumph, fragile and luminous, trembled under the weight of potential scandal. Her hand, still resting lightly in the Duke's, tightened subtly, a silent acknowledgement that vigilance was required even in moments of victory. The tension of society's gaze had not fully released its grip. The Duke inclined his head slightly, a gesture both protective and deliberate, recognizing the subtle threat without need for words. He offered no immediate words of reassurance, yet the strength of his presence and the careful precision of his attention communicated more than any speech could convey. She drew a slow breath, feeling the balance of exhilaration and caution in equal measure. Triumph, she realized, was always tentative in the presence of those eager to diminish it. As the final notes of the waltz faded into a hush, their hands remained connected, fingers brushing, eyes locked, hearts quietly aligned. Society's whispers could be heard at the edges, but they had, for the first time, achieved a moment of equilibrium between vulnerability and acknowledgement. The ballroom had become, for a fleeting instant, a space in which courage and subtle defiance could be recognized, even amid scrutiny. And in that suspended instant, as candlelight flickered across gilded walls and frost-traced windows, she sensed the next movement. One word, one gesture, one decisive act might determine not only her social standing, but the course of a heart already irrevocably drawn. Snow fell in slow, deliberate flakes, each one catching the light of the lanterns that lined the garden path, casting gold against the silver sheen of frost. The estate lay hushed under winter's embrace, the crisp night air sharp against her cheeks. mingling with the soft heat that still lingered from the ballroom. She stood beneath the arch of climbing roses now stripped bare, her gloved hands twisting the folds of her cloak. The evening had been a test of courage, a ballet of scrutiny and acknowledgement, and yet she felt the weight of expectation pressing against her still. This time, not from society, but from the singular presence of the man who had observed her, guided her, and quietly altered the course of her world. The Duke emerged from the shadowed path, coat brushing the snow, boots leaving firm prints along the cobblestones. His dark hair was dusted with frost, and his eyes, deep and intent, captured hers immediately. The storm of whispers and judgment that had haunted the ballroom seemed impossibly distant here, replaced by the intimate gravity of two souls poised on the edge of revelation. He approached without ceremony, yet the air between them was taut with unspoken emotion, a current of recognition and restraint that thrummed beneath the night sky. "Do you realize," he began, voice low but firm, "that you have altered more than my perception of you? You have unsettled the assumptions of all who would have reduced you to a jest." She lifted her gaze, cheeks flushed with cold and exhilaration, and found in him a seriousness that matched the storm of her own heart. I only sought to endure," she admitted softly, "to survive the cruelty that seems woven into every ballroom and hallway." The Duke's expression softened, a rare vulnerability passing across the stern line of his face. "Endurance is a quiet triumph," he murmured, "but what you have shown tonight, grace, courage, dignity, is far greater." She felt the warmth of his words seep into her, a balm to the lingering ache of humiliation that had haunted her for weeks. The snow fell heavier now, tiny motes catching in her hair, clinging to her lashes, and yet she felt entirely awake to the world, acutely attuned to the gravity of this moment. His hand extended, deliberate and unwavering, a tether to the courage she had discovered within herself. She placed her gloved hand in his, the contact intimate but commanding, a connection forged in shared acknowledgement and the quiet thrill of vulnerability embraced. "You need not fear the judgment of others," he said, voice measured but insistent. "Tonight, what was once a cruel spectacle becomes a testament. They may whisper, they may speculate, but they cannot diminish what is true." Her heart swelled, recognition dawning that the power she had thought lost, dignity, presence, the capacity to command regard, was restored, magnified by the gravity of his attention and the deliberate protection he offered. He stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until the night. The snow, the hush of lanterns seemed to condense into a single point of focus. The unspoken promise in the curve of his hand, the intensity of his gaze. She drew a slow breath, feeling the tension of weeks melt into a single instant of clarity. "I never imagined," she said softly, "that one step, one choice, could hold such consequence." He inclined his head, a shadow of a smile brushing his lips, and replied, "Yet it has carried my heart straight to yours." Their hands remained connected, fingers brushing lightly, a tactile dialogue of trust and mutual recognition. The snow fell around them, pure and silent, mirroring the clarity that had settled over her thoughts. She understood now that her journey from humiliation to acknowledgement was not complete without this final confrontation of presence, of intent, of unspoken emotion made tangible. Every glance, every careful motion of the Duke's hand, every pause of breath was a sentence in a language only they could read. She stepped closer, emboldened by the alignment of courage and recognition, and he responded with equal measure, the space between them dissolving into intimacy. A subtle tremor ran through her, a mixture of exhilaration and apprehension, yet she did not retreat. The snow, the lanterns, the hush of the night, all conspired to render the moment sacred, a pause outside the scrutiny of society. And in that stillness, she realized the full weight of what had transpired, that the public jests, the whispered scandals, the cruel glances could never eclipse the power of one courageous act met with true acknowledgement. He lowered his voice, almost a whisper, yet charged with the gravity of revelation. I have watched many perform, many bow to expectation, yet none have moved me as you have. You are no longer the object of jest, nor the subject of rumor. You are incomparable. Her breath caught, a warmth blooming in her chest that matched the flush of snow-touched cheeks. The words, deliberate and measured, carried with them the authority to reshape the evening, her reputation, and perhaps even the course of her own heart. A gentle wind swept across the garden, stirring the last petals of frost-bound roses, and she realized the enormity of the choice before her. To step fully into the possibility of recognition, of affection, of love freely given, or to retreat into the careful shadows of self-preservation. Yet the weight of his gaze, the subtle insistence of his hand, and the resonance of his words left her no room for hesitation. Courage, once a private act of endurance, became a shared declaration, an intimate triumph. As the lanterns flickered and the snow continued its delicate descent, she smiled, faint but resolute, and the Duke inclined his head, acknowledgment and promise entwined in the single gesture. The world beyond the garden might still murmur and judge, but here, in the hush of frost and lantern glow, one step, one choice, one quiet act of courage had shifted everything. And in that luminous stillness, she felt the first brush of certainty that humiliation had yielded to triumph, that cruelty had yielded to recognition, and that love, slow, deliberate, undeniable, was theirs to claim.